Hey everyone, great to be with you again. I'm excited to be joined by Catherine Turcer with Common Cause. We're going to talk about redistricting and why it matters. So I'm going to hand it over to you immediately, Catherine.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity to talk about something that impacts our everyday life. And yet, somehow, because it happens behind closed doors and because it's about the map making, it's really easy to ignore. So I'm really glad to be here to talk about gerrymandering and the manipulation of district lines and how it impacts our vote and ultimately public policy. I am Catherine Turcer with Common Cause Ohio. I'm the executive director, and before that, I was the director of the Money in Politics project. And I always talk about Common Cause's work as being a little like eighth grade social studies. We pay a lot of attention to the rules of government and what are the things that invite people in. Think about voting. What are the things that make it so that our vote isn't meaningful? So, like gerrymandering. What are the kinds of things that exert undue pressure? So, let's think about money in politics. One of the things that I've really liked about this kind of work is it allows me to think really big picture, but then also work on really important projects like improving the map making. And so I'm glad to be here to talk about what that's like. I started working on gerrymandering and addressing voting districts in the late 90s. And I think one of the things that's really important is Ohioans have been worried about trying to figure out what to do about gerrymandering or the manipulation of those district lines for a long time. So the first citizen initiative was in 1981. And actually, League of Women Voters, Common Cause were part of that at that time. But it's been a long, hard road. I'm so glad that so many people are caring about gerrymandering because when I started, people would go, gerrymandering? Oh, yeah, I kind of know what you're talking about. And now more and more people know about the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard to ignore that. At least in Ohio, I
Mhm.
was born and raised in Ohio. I definitely was raised with this opinion that Ohio was like this great state,
Mhm.
proud to be from. And the older I get, the worse Ohio seems to be getting, even just like statistically, worse in education, worse in standard of living, that all of which matters so much to Ohioans. And why is that happening? And is it because our government seems like they're not serving us anymore? It seems like the government isn't working for us anymore. Could that be connected to gerrymandering?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about like gerrymandering is like a portmanteau. So Jerry was Elbridge Gerry, which became Jerry. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he created a crazy district that looked like a salamander. It was like this. And so what happened is it became, he became known for gerrymandering. Um, what's important about that? There was a political cartoon about the gerrymander in 1812. Okay, so
So
I
a
guess
while
one
ago.
of the things I want to be super clear about is we've had gerrymandering for a long time, and it is embedded in our democracy. It's embedded, and that means that this is a guy, Elbridge Gerry. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He advocated for the Bill of Rights, but when push came to shove, what he did is what was best for his political party, not the best thing for voters. Now, what's different now, between 1812 and now, is that now with computers, map makers can very precisely carve up districts. They can, slice and dice, in a way where they call it packing, where they push a bunch of voters together that are like-minded, or cracking, where they dilute them with others. And it impacts us incredibly deeply across the country, but especially here in Ohio, where we have, received, our maps have received an F from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And gerrymandering impacts us, of course, when we go to vote, but we should remember that it impacts us every single day. And the reason that it impacts us every single day is if it impacts your vote, it impacts who you send to the state house.
Mm-hmm.
And they make decisions that impact us every single day. And it impacts who we send to DC to represent us. It impacts how connected our elected officials are to us. And they don't necessarily have to care what we want because the election is somewhat predetermined.
What I see in our districts, and we've been experiencing as Planned Parenthood Advocates of Ohio, is the accountability, being able to talk to our lawmakers. And one of our biggest responsibilities as advocates is connecting our supporters, our patients with their lawmakers. So if they're lawmakers, they're the constituents. They're taking the time to make phone calls. They're taking the time to send emails. A lot of times they're taking the time to show up in person in Columbus and testify. And for years, we saw our patients and our supporters being ignored. And that means that accountability, that connection that you're talking about, Catherine, that's been eroded. That accountability doesn't exist. And so the result that we've seen with reproductive health care is that year after year, we are having worse and worse reproductive health policy passed in Columbus. And that really for us started in 2011. There was a majority in both the House and Senate, and we had the governor were all Republicans. And that's when the first 6-week ban, abortion ban, was introduced, as well as several other abortion restrictions. And so at the beginning, around 2012, 2013, we had restrictions that were really harmful for providers, definitely made an impact on the quality of care for patients. But abortion was still legal. But year after year, we saw more and more extreme, like all the way to the right, Republicans being elected in their districts. Because, one of the things that you see in gerrymandering is that the primary is where the decision is made about who's going to get elected. And over time, we see, and obviously this is on both sides, but here in Ohio in the last decade and a half, we've seen it with Republicans, is that there isn't any kind of support for compromise or for listening to constituents. Where the support is like who's giving you money in the primary or who's going to challenge you in a primary. So it actually leads to people with more extreme views getting elected that are, again, disconnected from their constituents and disconnected from the voters in their region. And I feel really confident saying that in 2025, because eventually what happened is that in Ohio, we lost access to abortion. And so all of these laws that were passed by the most extreme side of one party, and in this case, the Republicans, it led to the complete loss of access here in Ohio. And of course, that also happened nationwide with the loss of Roe v. Wade. But here in Ohio, we'd been saying for a decade that the majority of voters supported abortion. And then we didn't have it. So we had to, as Ohio voters, come together and pass a ballot initiative, which is extremely onerous, extremely expensive, completely worthwhile, but really hard. But everybody was motivated because we were losing access to abortion. And what do you know? 57% of Ohioans support access to abortion. They support reproductive freedom. And when they had the option to speak for themselves without the disconnected lawmaker in between, they came out and they voted for reproductive freedom in 2023. And that's why we have access to abortion now, because we have access to the ballot initiative. But, we also know that these lawmakers, they don't want us to have that access. I think you were a part of the coalition who fought to protect one person, one vote. Do you want to talk about just how gerrymandering also connected to the lawmakers not listening to voters and putting out a barrier in 2023, the August election?
So one of the things that I think is amazing is the entire state house can be filled with people telling them no, do not do this. The entire state house. And so when I think about the attack on direct democracy, so that ability to do a citizen initiative, it's just enraging to think about the thousands of people that were making so much noise that they could hear it as they were voting on it, and they just closed their ears. And this goes back to like what you were talking about okay, the primary becomes more important than the general election. And that means during a primary, you're talking about the political party faithful. And the political party faithful, and Democrat or Republican, they are going to be more ideological. They're going to be more extreme. And that combination of it only having the primary be the driver of who ends up at the state house. It's funny. I'm thinking about kind of the money in politics again. And the reason I'm thinking about this is I don't know if you know this, but in 2010, the House was a Democratic House, Democratic speaker, and the Ohio Senate was Republican. And what happened is after Citizens United, that decision that said corporations could participate in elections, Project Red Map spent a ton of money basically to go after state races, that those, Ohio House and Senate races, so that they could get Republicans in both chambers, and basically ended up leading to a supermajority in both chambers. And so because those more extreme folks get elected in primaries, and because the more extreme folks here in Ohio are part of the GOP, they are very focused on taking away people's bodily autonomy. And, one of the things that is really crazy is they continue to focus on it, even though rights are literally embedded in the Ohio Constitution. And I think, many voters that participated, in that election in 2023, I don't think they had any idea that it would be so challenging to get an amendment that they supported actually implemented.
Absolutely. The fact that we have to litigate all 31 abortion bans and restrictions that were passed in that time before 2023. Between 2011 and 2023, the supermajority passed 31 abortion bans and restrictions. I mean, that is, again, completely, and every bill, we packed the state house, exactly like you said. We had hundreds of people testify. Everyone was rallying. I mean, 2019, when they passed the 6-week ban, there were people all over the state house screaming no. But, they passed it, and they felt confident that they would not be held accountable when they went back to their home district. That cannot be our system. It's not fair when elected officials are so confident that they're going to continue to win, even if they're ignoring their constituents, because they get to pick their voters in the system. And I know that there has been a lot of work. We've certainly been a proud partner in the redistricting coalition to fight back against this system that, as you said so clearly, like, why it got worse is yeah, computers. they're doing a better job at dividing and conquering their districts. What's going on now? Why are we talking about redistricting in 2025? But there's a lot that has gone into it. So what's happened?
So one of the things that it's really important to remember is that there have been Ohioans for 4 decades focused on creating fair districts. And it's been heartbreaking. I want to be really clear about that. After the 2010 election, when all of a sudden you had map makers that were Republicans and the minor party Democrats didn't have much say when it came to the 2011 maps. And so you had, the snake on the lake. So that district that started in Toledo worked its way along at Lake Erie and ended up in Cleveland. And you had Jim Jordan's Duck District. And I think we can often think, like, when I think of the precision of using computers and the, shall we say, Machiavellian intent, like, It's so clear that it was an attack on voters. And so that led to, in 2012, we did a citizen initiative called Voters First. And I was really hopeful. It included an independent citizens redistricting commission. It focused on creating greater transparency and some good rules about keeping political subdivisions or communities together. And I thought, all you have to do is look at that congressional district, right? Like all you have to do is look at like that or look at the whole map. And to understand it, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I know this is a podcast, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I thought it was really going to move people and help people understand. But people didn't. And we lost. But what happened is the state legislature got tired of, the knocks on the door about gerrymandering. And they started to come to the table and say, okay, let's create some new rules to put into the Ohio Constitution. And so in 2014, the state legislature, so December of 2014, the state legislature passed the rules that are currently in the Ohio Constitution. They include transparency. They include a prohibition on gerrymandering. Okay, I'm going to say that again. There is a prohibition on gerrymandering in the Ohio Constitution. Also, it included a metric so you could identify gerrymandering. Because it's easy to say, oh, that's gerrymandering. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Ugly is too. And so, we included a metric that is in the Ohio Constitution. You look at how people voted, meaning Ohioans, how Ohioans voted over a decade, statewide races, so there are no districts. And then you say, okay, pretty much the district should lean that way. So, if you think about it as 55% Republican, so districts they should lean that way, and 45% Democrats, well, it should lean that way. And that metric, sometimes it's called representational fairness, sometimes it's called proportionality, but it is a really good metric. It is in the Ohio Constitution. The requirement for transparent map making is in the Ohio Constitution. There are requirements for keeping political subdivisions together. Now, it wasn't until 2018 that we managed to pass congressional redistricting reform. We left elected officials in charge of the map making. And the reason we did that is the legislators would never, ever pass anything that took the power of drawing those voting districts away from them. There was this whole faceless bureaucrats will be drawing. Who knows who these people are? Okay, it's a compromise. And unfortunately, what was proven is that folks who draw district lines, focus on their own political party. It's such a conflict of interest. It's really hard for them not to think about their own future, not to think about the future of their friends. And essentially, what happened is that over and over and over again, they were sent back by the Ohio Supreme Court to draw new district lines. And they just dragged their feet, didn't do any better. And we have been voting on unconstitutional districts.
It's so hard to accept that we actually have this protection in the Constitution. We should have proportionality. I mean, how far are we from having proportionality now with the districts that actually were passed that we've been voting under since 2021?
Well, based on that metric of representational fairness, we should have 8 Republican districts and 7 Democratic districts.
Whew.
What do we have? We have 10 Republican districts, 4 Democratic districts, and 1, this is a toss-up. Now, a Democrat is sitting in that seat, but think about that. It's clear that manipulation of district lines really impacts who we send down to Washington. And right now, we're in the midst of a series of different crises. But think about the fact that we don't have folks that want to listen to us because of gerrymandering. And when I say us, they're not accountable to the voters. So they're not necessarily listening to any of their voters. They're paying attention to their party elders. They're paying attention to the money. They're just ordinary voters. They're not caring about, period.
Absolutely. And at such a critical time for our state and our country to have so many Ohio voters frankly silenced because, their vote isn't making the difference that it should be because of how, the district that they happen to live in and the unfairness of our maps, even though, it was protected in the Constitution. I mean, that there is absolutely a direct line to the loss of healthcare access and funding, especially for Medicaid, the continued cuts to public education, our continued cuts to social services across the board. I mean, it's completely disconnected from what Ohioans need because we have lawmakers who are completely disconnected from Ohioans.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad. And this is why, last year we did that citizen initiative, citizens not politicians. And the goal was, okay, well, if we can't trust the map makers to do the right thing, let's just take them out of the equation. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of signatures that had to be collected. I mean, just
it was a record. More people signed the petition to fix gerrymandering, to protect redistricting in Ohio than any ballot initiative before. And I say that as someone who led a ballot initiative.
And so the thing, sometimes people say, "Oh, how hard can it be to collect signatures?" It's hard work.
It's so hard.
And I think it's important work because it's one voter talking to another voter. It is really truly direct democracy. It was intended to be this check on the state legislature if they were not meeting our needs. It's an incredibly valuable process, but it takes years off your life. And it was just incredibly challenging. And we lost not because we didn't have a good amendment or a good change to the Ohio Constitution. We lost because the Ohio ballot board lied to voters. And what they put on everybody's ballot was that the goal of the amendment was to gerrymander. This kind of Orwellian scheme was so confusing to voters that even folks who were with us got confused and voted no. They also did that red shirt, blue shirt thing. Well, if you're a Republican, don't vote for this. Good Republicans would not vote for this. And, that's those nasty liberals. And so that was the other ploy. But I have not gotten over the fact that there was a lie on voters' ballots. And, the chair of the ballot board is, of course, the Secretary of State. And I think we should be very clear as we're thinking next year about voting for Secretary of State, that those election officials, clearly they carry lots of weight for a lot of reasons. But we need to be thinking about a ballot board that is not essentially going to take away our voice, take away our ability to make a good, informed decision. So one of the things that we need to be super clear about is that, for example, in the ballot language, it said that it was going to cost taxpayer money to create an independent citizens redistricting commission. Well, of course it is. But it's also important to remember that the folks that serve on that ballot board, whenever that ballot board comes together, that costs us money. Whenever the Ohio Redistricting Commission, which is what we currently have, comes together, it costs us money. And lawsuits cost us money. So for example, citizens not politicians were like, this is a lie, and you have to go off to the Ohio Supreme Court, which was challenging, by the way. But what's important here is just how when we make policy choices, we can be wasting money. And when there's an abuse of power, it's also a waste of our taxpayer money.
And I think it's fair that Ohio voters don't expect their elected officials to lie to them, to work so hard to deceive them. But here in Ohio, we have two really close, clear cases with the 2023 August special election, that they had voted to get rid of August special elections and then voted to bring it back so that they could put a change the ballot initiative process to make it a 60% threshold instead of 50+1. That was also that voters vote in November on the Ohio Reproductive Freedom Amendment, so that wouldn't count. And luckily, voters saw through that. I think we benefited in November from the fact that we also received very bad language on the ballot board. I remember a focus group listening to voters who said, they were like, well, they wrote this really badly. And I was like, this is not what we wrote. But it was, it did sound like anti-abortion propaganda, but abortion is such a personal issue that voters going in really already had they knew how they were going to vote, especially with, our all the communication they were getting. But, it's a personal issue. What the language on the ballot, I think in the end did not hurt us in the same way. But redistricting is not intuitive. You don't necessarily have a feeling for how you're going to vote. You were reading the language and it's confusing and it's saying, oh, this is going to cause gerrymandering. I mean, it was such a blatant lie, and it did make a confusing issue so much more confusing. And so it is really important to say that Ohio voters did not get a fair chance to make a decision on their decision on redistricting. And I think they deserve another chance to make that decision. And unfortunately, we still have this ballot board that is completely against us. But you're right. The Ohio Secretary of State is on the ballot next year. So we have the option to vote for someone who is talking about fairness in elections and access to elections and not putting their thumb on, the ballot board. So it'll be exciting to talk about that, come next year. But, right now in 2025, we're talking about redistricting because there is, one, rule that they did have to follow in the new redistricting rules. They're unconstitutional maps, so they aren't going to 2030. They have to redistrict mid-cycle. So can you talk about the rules and the process that's currently going on in Ohio around redistricting and really, why this conversation is so timely?
When we watch all this kind of mid-decade redistricting, it can be like, oh my goodness, Trump is trying to do this here in Ohio. Well, here in Ohio, we are the only state where it was required, redistricting is actually required for congressional districts. And that is because when the maps were passed, by in this case, the Ohio Redistricting Commission. And you might say, well, why did she stumble over her words? That's because this is all very complicated. But in this case, the Ohio Redistricting Commission, only the Republicans, only the political party in power, those members, decided on the congressional map. Now, yes, it was declared to be unconstitutional. Then folks said, okay, we're just going to leave it in for another cycle, meaning, basically the Democrats and fair districts folks said, we're just going to let that stay because we're going to be redrawing the district lines again in 2025. And that's because in the Ohio Constitution, it says if you cannot get bipartisan buy-in, you have to go back to the drawing board. And that the maps drawn right after the census are only going to last for 4 years. Now, it was intended to be this kind of protection. It was intended essentially to say, okay, well, in 4 years, you don't know who the governor, the auditor, secretary of state will be. You don't know what's going to happen with the state legislature. Unfortunately, we're so cemented that we have a supermajority Republicans and Republicans statewide. So things aren't really different, but that was the reason for it. It was like, hey, nobody's going to want a 4-year map, right? Incumbents really hate that. They want to know where they're going to live. They want to know how this will all work. They wanted to understand their district because all of a sudden they may have to be driving even further away. They want to understand their districts. So we're back at it. Now, saying we're back at it for map making is always interesting because the map makers from the dominant party, so the Republican Party, they are very good at dragging their feet and introducing a map at the very last minute. And so there's this kind of complicated process in the Ohio Constitution. And remember, I talked about it being a compromise, but there was this idea of like, we're going to try to get to a bipartisan map. And if we can't, we're going to make tougher rules in that final stage. So first, there was a requirement to get, the state legislature with 50% of both political parties and, 2/3 of both chambers to support, a map. Well, they had 2 committee hearings. The Democrats provided a map that they introduced on September 9th. Republicans have not yet shared an idea, a proposed map, like one for the public to consider. Next up, we have the Ohio Redistricting Commission, governor, auditor, secretary of state, and legislative appointees, and they will have until Halloween. What's spooky is then there's the 3rd stage where it goes back to the legislature. And at the legislature, at this point, they can pass it. They can pass a congressional district map, those news voting districts, with a simple majority. Now, there will be tougher rules. They do have to do a report about how they actually created the map. They have to not just focus on keeping counties whole. There's a focus on keeping counties, cities, townships whole. That idea of like you constrain their ability to get into a lot of nonsense by doing that. But the past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. And these folks, we don't know what they're going to do, but what we do know is they're very likely to drag their feet, not share a map, not actually create fair districts. And even though, Speaker Huffman has said, hey, we're not going to do what Trump wants, it's very clear that they have their eye on reducing the number of Democratic seats.
And that's just because they want more Republican seats. We haven't, it's still around 45% Democratic voters in Ohio, around 55% Republican voters in Ohio, and we're already living under a map that doesn't meet that, proportion. And to the idea that we could lose more Democratic voices at this critical time where, everyone's voice matters, certainly everyone's vote matters, but there is an imbalance in power, in the U.S. House of Representatives. And of course, it's congressional redistricting that we're talking about today, and that's what's being voted on in the mid-year maps. And we can't afford to have our voices limited any more than they already are. And 2026 is going to be such an important election. It is the first election where we get to say, no, you can't cut our Medicaid. You can't cut our public schools. You can't cut resources for mothers and for infants and for kids who, need free lunch. Like, the idea that we have elected leaders at the U.S. House of Representatives who've taken away food from children, but it just breaks my heart for the Ohioans who are looking at their paychecks that they don't it doesn't make as big of an impact as it should, and with inflation going up, all of our costs are going up. We need elected officials who are in touch with their voters and who know that. Who are listening and are ready to fight for the resources that Ohioans deserve, that our families deserve. And we can't afford to lose one person in that fight. And, I wish that I saw Republicans fighting for us. I wish I saw them answering the phone and showing up to meetings and having any kind of public discourse on this huge legislation that is passed and is impacting us and is going to impact us for years. I think they are going to drop a terrible map, because why else hide the process? Why miss the deadline? Why not share what you're thinking, what your plans are? They've done this before. They have the experience, but they are going to leave us with less democratic voices. That is their goal. Now, I know that we as voters, we're not going to give up on those races, and we'll talk about that in a second. But at a time where this is the first election since this huge bill passed that impacts us so deeply, takes away free lunch, takes away other resources for public education, it takes away WIC, money for infants and for mothers, it takes away Medicaid in Ohio. And some of these, it may take a couple of years for the impact to be felt by all Ohioans, but we're already seeing rural hospitals close because they know that Medicaid isn't going to be covering their patients any longer. So these are real impacts that are happening to Ohioans right now, and we can't lose any fighter in this fight. We can't lose democratic voices who are the ones who voted no, who are listening to their constituents. Right now, Republicans aren't. They're not having public hearings. They're not listening to constituents who have been saying, no, we don't want this bill to pass. And they're not listening to the impact. So we can't have more Republicans in a state that should, have an 8-7 split. But it's not because of the party. It's because of how their party is behaving. And it's because they don't want to listen to Ohioans, and they don't want to hear the impact. And frankly, they don't seem to care at all, because they very happily made this transition of funds for services that would have supported the majority of Ohioans, that now are going to the very few that are very wealthy and don't need these services. That's what I see as the big, terrible bill. It was a big grab of money from everyday Ohioans who are working to serve their families to give them to multimillionaires and billionaires. And that's what we're going to see continued if we don't have a meaningful election in 2026. And they're trying to take that away from us here with this redistricting fight, where, they're not showing us the map so that they can slip in the worst map possible at the, final hour.
So one of the things that happens for voters is, they hear this talk about Democratic districts and, hey, they want to eliminate some Democratic seats. And they think, oh, this is about Democrats and Republicans, and it's just the old nasty politicians. It's just business as usual. This is not business as usual. The more manipulated the districts are, the more it manipulates your vote. And the more it manipulates your vote, the less accountability all of us voters get from the folks that we send to Washington and the folks that are serving at the State House. So as we think about addressing voting districts and creating voting districts that are compact, that are naturally not manipulated to advantage one political party over the other, it's good for Democrats and it's good for Republicans. And it's good for people who are independent, because it's good for all voters.
I think we talk about this like in reproductive healthcare. Like, we don't think reproductive healthcare should be political. We're responding to the fact that it's been made political. And, this is all about making sure that each individual voter's vote matters, and that in a democracy that we first and foremost protect democracy, and that we protect free and fair elections. And it's important that each individual voter, each citizen, that they matter to their elected leader, and that there is a connection. And what we see in the gerrymandering in Ohio is that breakdown in that connection. And that's why we see these egregious bills being passed unanimously that, aren't supporting either party when it comes to, who really needs access and resources. And I think that it is hard when we have elected leaders not listening to their constituents. And yet, it is incredibly important that all of us continue to put pressure on our elected leaders, that they do hear from us and that they do see citizens showing up to public hearings, that they do get phone calls into their offices, that they do get the emails and the letters, because the more they are able to do this on their own, the more power they're going to grab for themselves. The only way we can take power back, the power that we are owed, that we deserve as voters in a democracy, is if we participate, that we make the phone calls, that we, write the letters, that we show up in person. And that is the call to action right now. We want folks to be paying attention to the map making, to the hearings. You can follow Planned Parenthood Advocates of Ohio online. You can follow Common Cause. I'm going to hand it to Catherine to talk about how you can pay attention to the redistricting commission and the redistricting coalition. And, how can Ohio listeners get involved in this fight right now and make a difference?
So I really encourage all of us to pay attention to what's happening with the map making. And, many of us will say, well, I don't know, should I go testify at the State House? Maybe not. But this is your opportunity to go to the State House to actually say, hey, I want my community to be as much as possible kept whole. I want a compact district. I don't want my district manipulated to advantage one party or the other. And then I also think there is where's the map? If all you're up for is making a phone call and calling your legislator, calling the governor, the auditor, the Secretary of State, and just being like, where's the congressional map? We deserve to see it. We want to be able to do public input. So as you're thinking about, simple activities, the where's the map activity is the best way to put pressure on, and it's super short. I also, on fairdistrictsohio.org, you can actually, follow what's going on. We update with hearings and meetings. We also have that on the Common Cause site, which is commoncause.org, and then a /Ohio. And one of the things that makes this work worthwhile is that we're doing it for all voters, and that we deserve to participate in a democracy that actually works. Also, I want to highlight, it's a little bit of fun to nag these people, to be like, well, wait a second. It's in the Ohio Constitution. Where's the map?
They need to know we're paying attention, and we're going to continue paying attention through this fight and the next. And we still have the opportunity to change voters' minds. And so the next election may not be so comfortable for them, especially as the impacts of what these lawmakers, what they voted on in DC comes back here to Ohio. So this is the time to pay attention and to take action, and to follow along at fairdistricts.org, at Common Cause /Ohio.org, and Planned Parenthood Advocates of Ohio.org, because we are all paying attention, and we are all going to be connecting voters to their lawmakers throughout this fight. And we're not giving up. We're going to be as active next year as we are right now. And they have to fear us, because we are powerful together, and we're not giving up.
Thanks for listening. It's going to take all of us for autonomy to rise. So subscribe, and share. Support our work by donating to Planned Parenthood Advocates of Ohio. Visit us at plannedparenthoodaction.org. And don't forget to text CARE, C-A-R-E, to 22422 to protect Medicaid and Planned Parenthood for all.